does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be a Muslim? Is it enough to say you're a Muslim and not do anything? There are so many in this land. We seek Allah's refuge, our own children and grandchildren, meaning the Muslim communities. There are so many whose parents are, mashallah, the best of the best. Board members, imams, du'at, coming Fajr Salah. And their sons and daughters have nothing to do with this religion whatsoever, other than the title, I'm a Muslim. They will not even take off Friday to come and pray Jumu'ah. They will not even care about Eid. But if you ask them, they say, oh, I'm a Muslim, yes. My parents are Muslim, yes. It's very common. Are they Muslim? Some ulama said no, some ulama said yes. And those that said no have a long list of evidences. Those that said yes, they primarily use this hadith. Because this is a man or an old man or woman is going to say he doesn't pray, he doesn't fast, he doesn't do anything, but he simply says, yeah, I remember my forefathers saying this word. I don't know what it means. And by the way, another tangent, completely irrelevant, yet so relevant. The Muslims who came to this land as slaves, they were not able to preserve their religion. They were not able to preserve their Islam. Completely. Allahu Alam how many Muslims came, but they are in the tens of thousands in the very least. Think about that, by the way. In the tens of thousands, Muslims were brought here from West Africa, from the coasts of Africa, from what is now Senegal and these regions. They were brought here as slaves. We know so many of them. Ayyub ibn Sulaiman, we know. And Bilali, we know. We know them. We have pictures of them. We have handwritten documents in the Smithsonian. We still have Qur'ans that they wrote from memory. We still have them in this land. These were slaves that had memorized the Qur'an. Some of them were ulama. Some of them were princes. They came here. And interestingly enough, this is a complete tangent, but hey, we should know this stuff. We are, in the end of the day, American Muslims, and we should know our own Islamic history in this land. A very interesting quirk, by the way, and I'm watching the time, don't worry, and I did promise you Q&A. Everything is there, inshallah. But let me go into this tangent. It's not prepared, but it's very interesting. There was this slave owner back in the 1800s who came across a Muslim slave and appreciated the Islam of that slave and realized Muslims are educated, Muslims can manage finances, and Muslims are trustworthy. So he made it a point to purchase Muslim slaves. And he had a plantation off the coast of Georgia on an island called the Sapelo Islands. The Sapelo Islands is called. Okay? This is all history you should know. And so on the Sapelo Islands, there was a large concentration of Muslim slaves, believe it or not. And they would establish the salah. They had a masjid. That is actually the first masjid of America. They celebrated Eid. How do we know this? Because the owners and the descendants of the owners kept diaries. And they talked about these Muslim slaves. And they mentioned that there was a festival in which they baked a particular cake that we now know it was the cake that Muslims would bake on Eid al-Fitr back home in Senegal or whatever. They would bake it on once a year and they would hand it out. This is in the Sapelo Islands. So this is in the 1860s, 1870s or so. Okay, obviously slavery is abolished, everything changes, whatnot. Okay, Sapelo Islands remains disconnected from the mainland. In the 1930s, Harvard University, or I should say Harvard, they sent a group of anthropologists to study the descendants of slaves. And they have a very, very extensive archive of audio, video material, because they wanted to preserve the accents, they wanted to preserve the heritage and video footage, not just in Sapelo, across America. It was a very, very well-researched project. And they went to the Sapelo Islands as well, obviously. And they interviewed the grandchildren of those people. They interviewed people in their 80s and 90s who have memories of their ancestors 3-4 generations ago. And what you read is mind-boggling. Of what you read, one of these people says, I remember I had an uncle so-and-so. Us kids would always make fun of him because he would go to one of the corner trees and fall flat on his face a few times a day. And another lady says, I had an aunt that she would always say phrases that would make us children laugh. And she said, I don't remember exactly, but it's something like, Ashmada gada, Ashmada gada, Ashhadu Allah. It begins Ashmada. That's what she remembers. This is in 1940. And she remembers one of her ancestors. She said, my aunt Henrietta, whatever, would always have something on her head. She said this. And she would always say these phrases that would make us kids laugh. And this is a lady in 90 years old. So go back, we're talking about 1860. And this is a lady now who came maybe in the 1830s. And she has a phrase that she is saying. Of course, these children are no longer Muslim. Islam is all gone, right? Obviously. But this hadith reminds us of that. That Islam is gone, but some phrase remains. So it's not just towards the end of times. Another story, quickly. This is not planned, by the way. I just want to benefit myself and all of you. And inshallah, what I like about teaching in my hometown, we have no deadline. When I go somewhere else, I have a deadline, I have to leave. When I'm here, alhamdulillah, we can go on and on. If I spend another 2 weeks, what's the problem? We can benefit, inshallah, correct? Inshallah. If Allah gives us life, inshallah. So, another interesting anecdote and story. And this happened with me, or I met the person. Andalus. And inshallah, we will have a long series of Andalus someday, inshallah. It's one of my favorite topics, the detailed history of Andalus, the rise and fall of the Muslims of Andalus. And this is something that I met in Andalus, where there was a person who converted back in the 80s to Islam, an Andalusian, from some of the villages outside of Qurtuba, not in the main cities. Make a long story, it's a very long story, make it short, inshallah one day I'll tell it to you in its full detail, that he was scared that his Catholic family, and especially his grandmother, who was a very hardcore Catholic, would get angry at him. So he would lock the door when he prayed. When he visited his grandmother, he would lock the door and pray. And one day he thought he locked the door and he didn't. You know, sometimes you turn the key. And his grandmother opened the door and he was in sajda. And he panicked. But what are you going to do? And his grandmother sat down next to him and began to cry. And the man became flustered, like, what am I going to do now? What do I tell my grandmother, etc., etc. He said the salam. And then he consoled his grandmother. Grandmother, don't worry, I still love you. Everything is fine. I'm normal, everything fine. And the grandmother said, no, I'm not crying because you converted to Islam. I'm crying because my grandmother told me that we are of those Muslim families. And to preserve Islam, at least in knowledge that we are Muslim. And I didn't do that. Like we know we're from the Muslim descendants. But I didn't do that, and seeing you prostrate, and obviously it's a Muslim sign, we know what it is, right? It obviously put all of these emotions back into me. So once again we get this phrase of this, she knows she's a Muslim. She knows, but she doesn't do anything like that, right? So there are exceptional scenarios. And back to this hadith now. The question is, are you a Muslim if you don't do anything? I will give you the mainstream response. This is my response as well. The general rule is that if you're living in a land of Islam, or in a land where Islam can be practiced, and you refuse to lower your head in sajda even once, and you refuse to fast even once, and you refuse to do anything of Islam, then mere self-identification does not make you a Muslim. However, in exceptional circumstances like the Sepelo Islands, like Andalus, like right now what we're going to mention, the end of the hadith, in those circumstances, maybe there is an excuse. That excuse is only when you don't have access to other Muslims, when you're all alone, when you're persecuted. In that case, if you don't do anything other than say, I'm a Muslim, perhaps that will be enough for you. And this is proven in this hadith. And now we come back to this hadith and then we'll pause for today, inshallah ta'ala, and give you at least 6 minutes for Q&A, inshallah. Hudayfa said, a time will come when the Quran will lift it up, nobody will pray, nobody will fast, nobody will do this. His student said, of what use is to say the kalima without doing any of these things? And Hudayfa turned away, turned away, turned away. The third time he said, Ya Sila, O my student whose name is Sila, Ya Sila, it will save them from the fire of hell. That kalima will save them from Jahannam. So when there's nothing left, perhaps identifying with Islam is all that is needed. But this is an exceptional situation and scenario. Now what this also shows, an elderly man will say, I remember my forefathers say La ilaha illallah, which means there shall be an entire generation that is raised after the wind of Yemen. There will be at least 40, 50, 60 years. And in that generation, the new generation that comes, maybe simply knowing there's something called Islam and wanting to be it could be their excuse. But the default will be, these people will be the worst of the worst. They will be animals or worse than animals, because there is no salah, there is no Quran, there is no kalima, there is no morality. They will live like animals, and we will come inshallah next week. Upon this generation shall be the actual trumpet, but there's still a few more signs that need to be mentioned before the coming of the actual trumpet.